Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we saw the meeting between Colonel Tom Parker and Brian. They got to see each other's styles, and they learned from each other how they managed their artist. After that, we found out that Brian could have gotten the Beatles a much bigger percentage of profits from their movies, but he wasn't informed about the film business, and that was a shame. And we learned about his friendship with Nat Weiss and his style and taste in food and wine and clothes. He would be extravagant and frugal at the same time. So let's find out what he's up to today. By the time Brian arrived in America, his reputation preceded him. Epstein was sought by disc jockeys and writers. In New York, Doubleday had bought the American publishing rights to Brian's autobiography. And Brian found out the pictures would be different in the American book. Brian seethed with anger. It was his book, and he should have a veto over the pictures that went in it. So Doubleday phoned Haidt in London. "This man is rude, impossible," shouting at the pictures. Minutes later, Epstein on the phone to Hecht, he said, "I have met an impossible person from Doubleday. I cannot possibly allow them to use the photos they want. Withdraw the book from them." Haidt was in bed. It was the middle of the night in London, and he said to Brian, "We can't withdraw it. You've had the money." And Brian said, "Well, give it back to them." And Haidt said to Brian that there would be a lawsuit. So finally, Brian surrendered, and Doubleday repackaged the book, and he grudgingly agreed to some amendments. On one visit to New York, Brian met an actor-model named John Gillespie. The NIMS inner circle knew him as someone Brian had befriended, and Brian ended up hiring him to work at NIMS, and he would get £50 a week retainer. Brian and Gillespie's relationship soured in just 6 months. In early April of 1965, Brian went into New York City to see Cilla Black's performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. And Brian told Nat Weiss when he saw him that his boyfriend Diz Gillespie threatened him with a knife and stole money from him. Brian was fascinated with Gillespie and emotionally attached to him, and this made White puzzled. Brian had been threatened by Gillespie, but he was defensive of the boy. The more Weiss heard about Diz, the more he thought he sounded like every other boy on 45th Street, a $10 hustler. This was the time of the Shea Stadium tour of 1965. The Gillespie thing bothered him because he was in New York. Brian was worried about Gillespie making trouble for the Beatles on their big tour. He asked Nat to be his lawyer and deal with the problem. There was a confrontation between Weiss and Gillespie that took place at the Warwick Hotel. Gillespie was not a bad-looking boy, but he really was just a common hustler. Weiss said he started to tell me that he had been very nice to Brian, and Brian had made all this money, and he wasn't giving him a fair share. And Weiss said to him, "You're not Brian's partner." And Gillespie said, "Well, if he wants to get rid of me, at least he should take good care of me." Gillespie suggested £2,000 and a car. Nat was a brilliant guy, told Gillespie that, "If I had my way, I'd just have you taken care of by some friends I know." Weiss said he didn't really know anybody like that. He was just using it as a scare tactic. Weiss said he got angry and told him that he was just a cheap $10 hustler, and "I can't imagine what Brian sees in you." Weiss went back to Brian with his views, and Epstein wanted to gloss over the problem with as little fuss as possible. He was fond of Gillespie. More importantly, he didn't want problems affecting him on the Beatles' American tour. Weiss told Brian not to worry. And Brian, if worst comes to worst, he'll never come near you. Weiss said, "I always wanted to let loose on this person, but Brian really put strong reins on me." Brian said to Weiss, "Why don't you just give him something? So give him $3,000 and get rid of him." Back at the Warwick Hotel, Weiss presented Gillespie with the cash and an ultimatum. "This is it. Take it or leave it, or just get lost. Whatever you think Brian owes you for all your time, friendship, and everything like that, here's a gift. But if you're ever seen again near Brian or the Beatles, Brian will have nothing to say about what I do, because you'll be breaking your word to me." Gillespie signed papers of agreement, and he said he wanted to speak to Brian, and Weiss said it was too late. Brian by that time had left town. Brian thought the episode was over. Later on it would resurface with much uglier confrontation. Brian would rue the day that he thought he could buy off a problem. Brian once said that his large ego could no longer be contained by pop management. He wanted to add many more facets. He was looking for challenges, and in areas he would continue with his Midas touch. He was able to conceal his ego with his quiet, self-effacing style. Brian's closest friends were shocked when he moved into the record production. His debut act was one of Liverpool's best-known groups, Roy Storm and the Hurricanes. When Brian went to Liverpool, Rory asked him to be his manager. Brian said he wanted another group like I Need a Hole in My Head. Brian was at the controls at London's IBC Studios as Rory recorded 3 tracks, notably America from West Side Story. The record was released on the Parlophone label, dominated by the Beatles, and it failed. Brian didn't give up and announced that he would continue in record production with one of his own acts. He continued to sign artists to NIMS, and Brian was a judge in a West Country talent contest. The winning group was named the Rustics. Brian all of a sudden told him he would sign them to NIMS and be managed by him. In London, he became the producer of their first single. Just like Michael Haslam, they appeared in some of Brian's package shows, but never stood out. And then he also got a folk group called Silky, who was like Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Seekers, and he took them under his wing after they sent him a tape of their music. He gave responsibility of them to Alistair Taylor. Silky had a hit with John Lennon's song, You Got to Hide Your Love Away. Brian did his darndest, but he was sensible enough to realize that he couldn't win them all. So Brian's interest would be genuine during the signing period, but if a group failed to take off quickly, he tended to look for new stimuli. Boredom was a flashpoint, just as it had been at the Liverpool record shop. And it also got me thinking back to when Brian said he wanted to go into clothes designing. His mother knew that he got bored quickly, and it seems like he was that way even back then. The New Musical Express asked the question, when will the clear-out of Brian's Epstein stable begin? Brian Epstein predicted at the time that he would give the Beatles 2 or 3 years at the top. January 16th, at a recent Beatle concert in Bradford, Brian had been mobbed by hundreds of autograph hunters. He and the Beatles were secure, and there were questions about his other acts. Could Brian and his team maintain their grip? Brian went on the defensive. He said he was sure Jerry had a marvelous career ahead of him. He wasn't short of work. As for Cilla, if anyone thinks of her as being on the wane, she has a new record coming out at just the right time with the public interest in Cilla. She's going to make it to the top 10. And Billy J has a very good record coming out, and I think he will develop as a good singer. Brian felt that the Beatles, as he said earlier, would go on 2 or 3 years, and then he felt that they would be film stars. At EMI, George Martin felt that Brian had taken on too many acts. Brian would be flowery about his new people. He would call George and say, "It's such a wonderful group, George." He would ask him to listen to them because he was sure that George, with his talent, could do wonders for them. George said, "I hated to turn things down, but eventually I had to. I could not do everything. I was at my wit's end in the studio." George felt that the talent of the people he had brought in after the Beatles and Cilla and Jerry and the Pacemakers had deteriorated. After the Beatles, he then brought in Michael Haslam and Tommy Quickly. Epstein thought the formula would work every time, and it didn't. Whether they succeeded or not, the acts enjoyed working with Brian. The artists thought their success was assured, and they were baffled when they didn't get Brian's personal attention. When he started delegating artists within NIMS, and they failed to make long-lasting impact, he got disenchanted. Brian's personal fame made him uncomfortable, but he eventually accepted it reluctantly. Brian said in 1964 he had grown to enjoy being interviewed. He said, "I don't envy the Beatles. I could obviously not do what they do." And he would sign autographs, Brian Epstein and Beatles manager, Beatles in caps. When reviewing the Beatles in 1965, Brian told the author of the book, Ray Coleman, when he worked at Melody Maker, that John Lennon had a great mind and is a great person. One of the best people I've ever met, an interesting character to watch develop. George, he said, "I always think of him as a friend, a somewhat inconsistent person who can be difficult. Never has been with me. Great personal charm, but this goes for any Beatle." Ringo's arrival into the group was one of the Beatles' most brilliant doings. It was something they wanted, and that I carried out. And Paul McCartney was the most changed Beatle. He's mellowed in character and thought, a fascinating character and a very loyal person. Doesn't like changes very much. He probably more than the others finds it more difficult to accept that he's playing to a cross-section of the public and not just to teenagers or sub-teenagers whom he feels are the Beatles' audience. Speaking of the Beatles, Brian said, any faults they are supposed to have are never apparent individually. Their faults suffered only when they were together as a group, when there was too much talent in one room. Next, events had moved so swiftly that despite his grand lifestyle and high income, Brian had scarcely indulged himself, and it was time to restructure his organization. He got 15 people working on his staff. He moved to a separate office at Hill House, Stafford Street, off Piccadilly, at Wendy Hanson's suggestion, and this was to get away from the mayhem at the office. He would work with his pet projects, the Beatles, Cilla, and Jerry, and the rest he would left to a well-oiled machine to take care of. Wendy Hanson was the personal assistant to the Beatles and to Brian, and she needed an extra secretary at Hill House, and she got Joanne Newford, and she was 20 at the time. So I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we saw Brian get upset when the American book of his autobiography would have different pictures in it. Brian then met up with an actor model named Diz Gillespie, who was a $10 hustler, according to Nat Weiss. The relationship ended after 6 months, and Weiss was told by Brian to pay him off. He was gone for the moment. By the end of the video, we see that Brian felt like his formula for success would work every time, but when it didn't, he moved on to something that might be more promising. George Martin could see that Brian wasn't bringing in the same talent as he had earlier, and so he started to say no when Brian asked for help for his new act. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you would give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, as always. And as I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you go to the description part of the video and click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. And if you purchase something, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.